Sergeant Carl Miller stared in disbelief from his bunker position on Sword Beach at dawn on June 6, 1944. Through the lifting morning mist, dark shapes emerged from the sea itself. Not landing craft as expected, but machines moving under their own power. What appeared at first to be small boats suddenly transformed before his eyes, canvas screens dropping away to reveal the unmistakable silhouette of American Sherman tanks. The 26-year-old Wehrmacht veteran who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front later wrote in his hastily scribbled field diary, "They came from the water itself, like monsters rising from the deep. No warning, no landing craft, just tanks appearing as if by magic through the waves." What Sergeant Muller witnessed that fateful morning defied 4 years of German military intelligence assessments about Allied landing capabilities. The canvas screens that had kept the 33-ton Sherman tanks afloat collapsed in unison as treads hit the sandy bottom. Within seconds, these swimming beasts transformed into standard battle tanks, turrets already rotating toward German positions. Their main guns fired while still partially submerged, an impossibility according to every defensive preparation the Atlantic Wall commanders had made. As water streamed from their hulls, the machines advanced relentlessly toward the concrete emplacements that German engineering had declared impervious to frontal assault. For the defenders, it wasn't just the unexpected presence of armor in the first wave that proved shocking. It was the complete collapse of a fundamental assumption that tanks required ships to deliver them to shore, ships that could be targeted and destroyed before their cargo deployed. The revelation struck Oberleutnant Werner Pluskat, artillery observer for the 252nd Infantry Division, with particular force. Having spent the previous 18 months studying Allied landing capabilities and planning defensive responses, he had repeatedly assured his superiors that early tank deployment would be impossible given the rough Channel surf. His battle station logbook, recovered after the war, contained a single line written at 0630 hours. "They have swimming tanks. The reports were true. God help us now." That singular moment of recognition that the impossible had become possible rippled through German defensive positions across all 5 landing beaches. What these defenders witnessed wasn't just a tactical surprise. It was the physical manifestation of industrial ingenuity they had been told America could never achieve. Within hours, this revelation would shatter the confidence of even the most dedicated Wehrmacht defenders. The story of how American engineering created machines that defied German expectations and how that technological surprise helped crack the Atlantic Wall begins long before D-Day itself. It reveals a fundamental contrast between how Nazi Germany and the United States approached the challenges of modern warfare, and how that contrast would ultimately determine the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. Throughout the early years of World War II, German military planners had developed what they considered a comprehensive understanding of Allied landing capabilities. Based on their observations of previous amphibious operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, they had constructed a defensive doctrine that relied on a crucial assumption. Tanks, the most important offensive weapon in modern warfare, could only reach a defended shore via specialized landing craft that were vulnerable to coastal artillery and air attack. This assumption shaped the entire Atlantic Wall defensive system, a massive network of bunkers, artillery positions, and obstacles stretching from Norway to Spain. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with strengthening these defenses in late 1943, had based his strategy on this core belief. "The enemy must be defeated at the water's edge," he had famously declared to his staff. "Once they establish tanks on the beach, our position becomes untenable." Rommel's defensive innovations, millions of obstacles planted along the tidal flats, specifically designed to rip open landing craft, reflected his understanding that preventing tanks from reaching shore was the key to defeating any invasion attempt. German intelligence had tracked Allied development of specialized landing vessels with dropping ramps, but had detected no evidence of any alternative delivery system. The Germans had good reason for their confidence. Their own attempts to create amphibious tanks had proven disappointing. During preparation for Operation Sea Lion, the planned but never executed invasion of Britain in 1940, German engineers had experimented with floating versions of their Panzer III tanks. These efforts had yielded machines that were unstable, difficult to control in water, and dangerously vulnerable during the transition from swimming to fighting configuration. After several prototypes capsized during testing, killing their crews, the program was abandoned in favor of specialized landing craft. This failure reinforced the German belief that tanks and water didn't mix, a belief they naturally projected onto their enemies. What German intelligence failed to detect was the dramatic success of an alternative approach being developed by the Allies. In early 1941, a Hungarian-born engineer named Nicholas Straussler, working with the British military, had designed a remarkably effective system for making tanks amphibious. Rather than trying to make the tank hull itself watertight, the approach that had failed for German designers, Straussler created a collapsible canvas screen that could be raised around the tank's upper works, creating sufficient buoyancy to float the vehicle. Twin propellers powered by the tank's own engine provided propulsion through water. The British initially applied this duplex drive system to their Valentine infantry tanks, but by 1942 had begun adapting it to the more powerful American-built Sherman. The combination proved remarkably effective during testing, with the duplex drive Sherman, soon nicknamed the DD or Donald Duck tank, demonstrating the ability to launch from ships up to 5,000 yards from shore, swim through moderate seas, and then fight immediately upon reaching land. The system required only minimal modifications to the Sherman's basic design and could be retrofitted to existing vehicles. What made this development especially significant was the scale at which it could be implemented. By 1943, American factories were producing Sherman tanks at a rate that astounded even their own military planners. Nearly 50,000 would be built during the war. This massive production capacity meant that specialized variants, including the DD swimming version, could be created in quantities the Germans would have found impossible to match. While German tank production remained artisanal compared to American methods, with each panzer requiring skilled craftsmanship and extensive labor, Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines at a rate of 1 every 30 minutes in some factories. This production disparity reflected a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached industrial warfare. Nazi Germany, despite its fearsome military reputation, never fully mobilized its economy for war production until it was too late. Civilian consumption remained surprisingly high throughout the early war years, with full economic mobilization only occurring after the devastating defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943. By contrast, the United States had rapidly converted its enormous industrial base to war production following Pearl Harbor, creating what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The numbers told the story. In 1943, the peak year of German military production, their factories produced approximately 6,000 tanks of all types. That same year, American plants manufactured over 29,000, including nearly 17,000 Shermans. This 5-to-1 advantage in tank production alone gave the Americans the luxury of creating specialized variants, including the DD swimming tanks, without compromising their overall equipment needs. This production miracle was largely invisible to German intelligence. While they were vaguely aware of America's industrial potential, they consistently underestimated both its scale and efficiency. A 1942 assessment by the Wehrmacht High Command concluded that American tank production would be limited by skilled labor shortages and the complexity of modern tank design, a projection that reflected Germany's own manufacturing constraints rather than American reality. As late as January 1944, German military intelligence estimated that monthly Sherman production could not exceed 600 units. The actual figure was closer to 2,000. Even more significantly, German intelligence completely missed the development of the DD swimming capability. This failure stemmed partly from effective Allied security measures, The DD tanks were tested in remote locations, primarily in Scotland, where German reconnaissance was limited, but it also reflected a form of institutional blindness. Having convinced themselves that amphibious tanks were impractical, based on their own failed experiments, German analysts simply did not look for evidence that the Allies might have solved the problems differently. This combination of industrial capacity and technological innovation created a capability that German defenders considered impossible, and therefore were completely unprepared to counter. As intelligence reports about strange, swimming tanks occasionally reached German headquarters throughout 1943, they were consistently dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. A captured British commando's reference to tanks that swim during interrogation in December 1943 was explicitly rejected as obvious disinformation in the official assessment. Oberstleutnant Fritz Ziegelmann, a defensive works engineer who proposed modifications to beach obstacles, specifically to counter potential amphibious vehicles in February 1944, was reassigned to the Eastern Front after his proposals were deemed wasteful of resources based on fantasy weapons. His personal papers, recovered after the war, include a bitter note written just weeks before D-Day. They refuse to believe what they cannot themselves achieve. This dismissal of intelligence that contradicted established beliefs reflected a wider problem within the German military hierarchy. The few German officers who took these reports seriously enough to request defensive adjustments found themselves overruled. As the war progressed, an increasing disconnect developed between frontline observations and high command assessments. Field commanders who reported Allied capabilities that exceeded German expectations were often accused of defeatism or exaggeration. This dynamic created a self-reinforcing cycle of false confidence that left German forces vulnerable to precisely the kind of technological surprise the DD tanks would represent. The Americans, for their part, recognized the potential psychological impact of the DD tanks beyond their tactical value. Planning documents from April 1944 specifically noted that the sudden appearance of tanks from the sea will create confusion and dismay among defenders who believe the beach must first be secured by infantry before armored vehicles can land. Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding the American V Corps that would land at Omaha Beach, described the DD tanks as our secret weapon. They'll be shooting before the Germans realize they've arrived. The decision to deploy DD tanks across all 5 D-Day landing beaches, Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians, represented a massive commitment to this new technology. Of the approximately 700 tanks scheduled for the first day of the invasion, 254 were DD variants meant to swim ashore in the first waves. Their mission was crucial: provide immediate heavy firepower to support the vulnerable infantry during the critical minutes of landing. For crews of these specialized tanks, training had been rigorous and dangerous. Practice landings conducted off the British coast had demonstrated both the system's capabilities and its limitations. In calm conditions, the DD tanks performed remarkably well, with most units able to navigate accurately to their targets. However, seas above Force 3, with waves higher than 3 feet, proved problematic, sometimes causing catastrophic failures of the canvas flotation screens. During one particularly disastrous training exercise off Slapton Sands in April 1944, 6 DD tanks sank with the loss of 6 crewmen when unexpected heavy swells overwhelmed their buoyancy systems. These limitations created serious concerns among some Allied commanders as D-Day approached. The channel was notorious for rough conditions, and weather forecasting in 1944 remained more art than science. The operation plans included contingency provisions. If seas exceeded Force 3, the tanks could be carried closer to shore aboard their landing craft rather than swimming from the planned launch position approximately 5,000 yards out. This decision would be made by the naval commanders at each landing site based on conditions at the time. German defenders, meanwhile, remained completely unaware of what was coming. Their beach obstacles, vast arrays of concrete tetrahedra, steel hedgehogs, and wooden stakes, had been specifically designed to tear open landing craft at high tide or strand them at low tide. Nothing in their defensive preparations specifically addressed the threat of vehicles that could simply swim between and around these obstacles. The anti-tank walls and ditches they had constructed all began at the high water mark, leaving a critical gap in their defensive coverage. In the early hours of June 6th, as the invasion fleet approached the Normandy coast, sea conditions were marginal for the DD tanks, rougher than ideal, with waves reaching 4 to 5 feet in some sectors. This created a fateful divergence in how the tanks were deployed across the different landing beaches, with dramatic consequences for the initial assault. At Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing site, the naval commanders made the conservative decision to bring the DD tanks much closer to shore before launching them. Most were released less than 1,000 yards from the beach, allowing 32 of 34 to reach land successfully despite the challenging conditions. These tanks were among the first Allied units to engage the German defenders, providing crucial suppressive fire that significantly reduced casualties among the following infantry waves. Similar decisions were made at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, where most DD tanks were launched between 500 and 1,000 yards offshore. The results were equally successful. Of 90 DD tanks deployed across these 3 beaches, 75 reached shore in operational condition. Their arrival achieved precisely the psychological impact planners had hoped for, with German defenders reporting the shocking appearance of tanks from the sea itself in their frantic communications to headquarters. At Omaha Beach, however, a different decision was made. The naval commander, following the original plan more strictly, ordered the DD tanks launched at the full distance of 5,000 yards from shore. The results were catastrophic. Of 32 DD tanks launched, only 2 reached the beach under their own power. The rest were swamped by the heavy seas, with many sinking so quickly their crews barely had time to escape. Most of the crews survived thanks to life preservers and rescue operations, but the tanks were lost. This disaster had immediate consequences for the Omaha landings, which faced the strongest German defenses of any beach. Without armored support, the infantry suffered terrible casualties in the opening hours. The situation became so desperate that General Omar Bradley briefly considered abandoning the Omaha landing altogether. Only the extraordinary courage of individual soldiers and the belated arrival of conventional tanks directly landed from craft that reached the shore prevented a complete defeat. The contrast between Omaha and the other beaches provides a stark illustration of how significant the DD tanks were to the invasion's success. On beaches where they arrived in numbers, German defensive positions were quickly neutralized, and beachheads were secured according to schedule. At Omaha, where they were largely absent, progress was measured in yards rather than miles during the critical first hours. For the German defenders who witnessed the DD tanks in action, the psychological impact was profound. Having built their defensive doctrine around preventing tanks from reaching the beach, the sudden appearance of armor in the first wave, emerging directly from the sea, represented not just a tactical surprise, but a conceptual collapse. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, whose paratroopers faced the British and Canadian landings, later wrote that the sight of tanks appearing from the water created a sense that we were fighting not just against men and machines, but against sorcery. Lieutenant Franz Gockel, manning a machine gun position on Omaha Beach, described the moment when a rare DD tank that had successfully made the swim began firing on his position. It seemed impossible. The Americans had invented a tank that could swim. We had been told such a thing could not exist, yet there it was, firing while still in the water. If they could do this, what else might they bring against us? This sense that the invaders possessed capabilities beyond what German soldiers had been told was possible spread rapidly through the defensive positions, undermining morale, even where physical defenses remained intact. The few German tanks available for counterattack, primarily from the 21st Panzer Division near Sword Beach, found themselves facing an established Allied armored presence much earlier than their doctrine had anticipated. Rather than attacking vulnerable infantry struggling to organize on the beach, they encountered dug-in tank formations with pre-registered artillery support. Their counterattacks were repulsed with heavy losses, further reinforcing the psychological advantage the DD tanks had provided. As news of the swimming tanks reached German high command, the reaction mixed disbelief with growing alarm. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, initially dismissed reports as hysterical exaggerations from overwhelmed coastal units. But as confirmation accumulated throughout the day, the implications became impossible to ignore. An urgent intelligence assessment prepared that evening acknowledged that Allied forces have deployed amphibious tanks in significant numbers, a capability we had evaluated as technically infeasible. For Adolf Hitler, receiving the news at his headquarters in East Prussia, the revelation of the DD tanks fed into a growing conviction that German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood Allied technological capabilities. His famous rage during the evening military conference of June 6th focused specifically on this failure. We were told America could not produce specialized tanks in quantity. We were told amphibious tanks were impossible. What else have they developed that we know nothing about? This crisis of confidence would influence his strategic decisions throughout the crucial days that followed, contributing to the hesitation and confusion that allowed the Allied beachhead to solidify beyond the point where counterattacks could succeed. The story of the DD tanks on D-Day ultimately transcends their direct tactical contribution, significant as that was. They represent a larger pattern that would define the outcome of World War II, the triumph of American industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism over German military doctrine and technological assumptions. The United States did not necessarily design better tanks than Germany. The Sherman was inferior to German Panthers and Tigers in terms of armor protection and gunpowder. What America did was produce functional, adaptable vehicles in quantities the Germans could barely comprehend, and then innovate specialized variants that created capabilities their enemies had dismissed as impossible. This disparity extended far beyond tanks. By 1944, American factories were outproducing the entire Axis, combined by margins that seemed almost absurd: 6 ships for every 1 German U-boat sunk, 7 aircraft for every 1 lost in combat, 10 artillery pieces for every 1 destroyed. This production advantage created a form of strategic asymmetry that German military thinking, still rooted in traditional European concepts of battlefield excellence, struggled to comprehend. No amount of tactical skill or individual weapon superiority could overcome this fundamental material imbalance. What the DD tanks demonstrated on D-Day was how this production advantage could be translated into technological surprise. Because American factories could produce basic Sherman tanks so efficiently, engineers had the luxury of diverting resources to develop specialized variants like the DD. German industry, stretched to its limits, just meeting basic equipment needs, could not afford such diversification. Their tanks might be individually superior, but they could only perform the standard functions of tanks. The Americans, meanwhile, were creating tanks that could swim, tanks that could clear minefields with rotating flails, tanks that could bridge ditches or carry fascines, an array of specialized capabilities that gave Allied forces solutions to battlefield problems the Germans couldn't match. For the German soldiers defending Normandy on June 6, 1944, this reality materialized before their eyes in the form of tanks emerging from the sea. In that moment, many experienced what military historians would later identify as a crucial psychological turning point, the recognition that they were facing not just an enemy with more resources, but one with capabilities they had been told were impossible. Lieutenant Karl Meyer, an artillery observer on Gold Beach, captured this moment in his post-war memoir. "When I saw tanks driving out of the ocean, I understood for the first time that we were not merely outnumbered, but out-imagined." The DD tanks represented just one of many technological surprises the Allies deployed on D-Day. Specialized armor designed to overcome beach obstacles, advanced radar systems for naval gunfire control, and revolutionary communication networks all contributed to the operation's success. But the swimming Shermans held a special place in this array of innovations because they directly contradicted what German defenders had been assured was a fundamental limitation of mechanized warfare, that tanks and water don't mix. This contradiction created a cognitive dissonance that rippled through the German defensive system. Officers who had built their tactical plans around a specific understanding of what was possible suddenly found themselves facing capabilities that violated those assumptions. The resulting hesitation and confusion magnified the already significant material advantages the Allies brought to the battle. As one captured German officer told his interrogators several days after the invasion, "We knew you would come with superior numbers. We did not know you would come with superior imagination." The success of the DD tanks on most beaches also illuminates the single greatest failure of the D-Day landings, what happened at Omaha Beach. The decision to launch these tanks far from shore in rough conditions, rather than bringing them closer as was done elsewhere, created a cascade of challenges for the American forces fighting on what would become known as Bloody Omaha. Without the immediate armored support the DD tanks were meant to provide, infantry units suffered devastating casualties clearing the beach defenses. The contrast between the successful deployments at Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches and the failure at Omaha provides one of history's clearest examples of how technological advantages must be properly applied to be effective. The same innovative system that provided crucial advantages on 4 beaches became a liability at Omaha when employed incorrectly. This discrepancy underscores that innovation alone is never sufficient. It must be combined with sound operational judgment that recognizes both capabilities and limitations. For the DD tank crews who made the harrowing journey through the Channel waves on D-Day, their experience represented a unique moment in military history, the first and only time tanks would swim into combat on such a scale. Many described the surreal quality of that journey encased in a 33-ton metal vehicle floating precariously on canvas screens with only inches of freeboard, watching the distant shore through small viewports as waves crashed around them. Lieutenant James Pluscott of the 743rd Tank Battalion later wrote, "We weren't sailors or Marines. We were tankers meant to fight on land. But that morning we were something else entirely, something no one had been before." The men in those tanks knew they were the first wave, that the infantry following would depend on their success. This knowledge created an extraordinary pressure, especially for crews who had seen training accidents and understood the real possibility of sinking. Staff Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a DD tank commander with the 2nd Armored Division, expressed this burden in a letter home written the night before the invasion. "Tomorrow we try something that's never been done before. If it works, we'll save a lot of our boys on the beach. If it doesn't," he left the sentence unfinished. For many crews, the experience became more terrifying as they approached the coast and began taking fire while still vulnerable in the water. Unlike conventional tanks, which can respond to fire with movement and their own weapons, the DD tanks in swimming configuration were largely helpless until they reached shore. Their canvas screens blocked the use of their main guns, and any attempt at evasive maneuvering risked capsizing. As German defensive fire intensified, particularly on Omaha Beach, many crews faced the grim choice between pressing forward into increasing danger or attempting to return to the launch vessels. The psychological impact on the German defenders who witnessed the successful landings was equally profound. Having been assured that tanks could only reach shore via landing craft, which would be vulnerable to defensive fire while lowering their ramps, The sight of fully operational tanks emerging directly from the waves represented a fundamental violation of their tactical assumptions. Sergeant Joseph Mueller, defending a bunker on Juno Beach, described his reaction in a post-war interview. "We had prepared for everything except tanks that could swim. When I saw the first one emerge from the water, already firing, I thought I was hallucinating. By the time I realized what was happening, they were everywhere." This moment of disbelief was repeated across the invasion beaches as DD tanks made successful landings. For German soldiers who had been told repeatedly that their Atlantic Wall defenses would prevent armored vehicles from reaching shore in the critical early phase of any invasion, the appearance of tanks in the first wave created a crisis of confidence that transcended the immediate tactical situation. If their commanders had been wrong about this, what else might they be wrong about? The impact extended beyond the frontline defenders to the German command structure. Throughout the crucial first day of the invasion, reports of swimming tanks created confusion and disbelief at headquarters. General Erich Marx, commanding the German 84th Corps defending Normandy, initially dismissed such reports as panic-induced hallucinations. When photographic evidence reached his headquarters by midday, he reportedly stared at the images in silence before saying quietly to his staff, "If they can do this, what else have they achieved that we have deemed impossible?" For the Allied planners who had championed the DD concept, particularly Major General Percy Hobart, whose specialized armored division had developed many D-Day innovations, the mixed results provided both vindication and caution. Where properly employed, launched at appropriate distances given the sea conditions, the DD tanks had performed exactly as intended, providing crucial early armored support that saved countless infantry lives. The disaster at Omaha, however, demonstrated the fine line between innovation and overreach, between calculated risk and gambling with lives. In the days following D-Day, as Allied forces consolidated their beachheads and began the difficult fight inland, the legacy of the DD tanks continued to influence operations on both sides. For Allied commanders, the success on most beaches reinforced the value of specialized equipment designed to overcome specific battlefield challenges. For German defenders, the psychological impact of facing capabilities they had been told were impossible contributed to a growing sense of inevitability about the invasion's outcome. Oberstleutnant Helmut Meyer, an intelligence officer with the German 7th Army, captured this sentiment in a report written 3 days after the invasion. The appearance of amphibious tanks on D-Day represents more than a tactical surprise. It demonstrates an industrial and technical capability that fundamentally exceeds our own. The Americans are not merely producing more, they are producing things we cannot. This assessment would prove prescient as the campaign continued and additional American technological innovations, from proximity fuses for artillery to gyroscopically stabilized tank guns, continued to shock German forces. As the Normandy campaign progressed into a battle of attrition, the initial surprise of the DD tanks faded into the larger story of Allied material superiority. But for those who had witnessed their dramatic appearance from the sea on June 6th, the image remained indelible. A moment when the impossible suddenly became real, when the assumptions of years collapsed in minutes. Sergeant Kurt Weber, who survived the defense of Sword Beach to be captured 3 days later, summarized this impact in his interrogation. "When I saw tanks coming out of the water, I knew the war was lost. Not because of those tanks specifically, but because it showed what America could do, create what we thought could not be created, build what we thought could not be built, and in numbers we could never match." The story of the DD tanks ultimately transcends their specific contribution to the D-Day landings. They represent a larger truth about how World War II was won, not primarily through battlefield prowess or even strategic genius, but through the industrial might and engineering innovation that allowed the Allied powers, especially the United States, to overcome seemingly intractable military problems through material solutions. The German defenders, who watched in disbelief as tanks emerged from the Channel surf, were witnessing not just a tactical surprise, but the physical manifestation of why the Axis powers would ultimately lose the war. In the decades following World War II, the legacy of the DD tanks would influence military thinking about amphibious operations and technological surprise. Their success demonstrated the value of capabilities that opponents consider impossible, creating not just tactical advantage, but psychological impact that can ripple through enemy forces. Yet their failure at Omaha Beach also provided a sobering reminder that innovation must be tempered with realistic assessment of conditions and limitations. For the men who fought on both sides that day, the tank crews who made the perilous journey through the waves, and the defenders who watched in disbelief as they emerged, June 6, 1944, marked a moment when the abstractions of industrial capacity and technological innovation became concrete reality on the beaches of Normandy. The DD tanks, rising from the sea against all German expectations, embodied the material and conceptual advantages that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. Sergeant Carl Miller, whose diary entry opened this account, survived the war to return to his hometown near Munich. In 1964, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, he was interviewed by a local newspaper about his experiences. Asked what he remembered most vividly about that day, he didn't hesitate. The tanks that came from the sea. We had been told such things were impossible. When I saw them with my own eyes, I understood what we were truly fighting against. Not just soldiers, but a nation that could make the impossible possible. And they could do it not just once, but hundreds of times over. In that observation lies perhaps the most profound insight about how the greatest conflict in human history was ultimately decided, not on the battlefield itself, but in factories and laboratories thousands of miles away, where American production and innovation created capabilities that their enemies had dismissed as impossible. The DD tanks that shocked German defenders on D-Day represented just one manifestation of this decisive advantage, the ability not merely to outproduce the enemy, but to out-imagine them.